Through his canopy, Captain Carlisle Harris could see the target emerging through the haze below, a steel and concrete bridge spanning the Song Ma River. He was part of the largest strike package ever assembled against a single target in Vietnam. 79 aircraft thundering toward a structure the Americans believed they would destroy by lunchtime. What none of those pilots knew was that this bridge would become their nemesis. For the next 7 years, America would throw everything it had at this single structure. 871 sorties, 11 aircraft lost, 13 airmen dead or missing, 7 more captured and tortured in the infamous Hanoi Hilton. Harris himself would return the very next day, only to be shot down and spend nearly 8 years as a prisoner of war. And through it all, the bridge would stand, a grinning monument to American frustration and Vietnamese defiance. The North Vietnamese called it Ham Rong, the dragon's jaw. To them, it was more than infrastructure. It was a symbol of resistance against the most powerful military force on Earth. The Americans would come to call it the most heavily defended target in human history. The mathematics of their failure would eventually force a technological revolution that changed aerial warfare forever. But on that spring morning in 1965, the men flying toward the Dragon's Jaw believed they would destroy it by lunchtime. The bridge they were attacking had its own history of destruction and resurrection. During the First Indochina War against the French, Viet Minh guerrillas had destroyed the original structure in 1945, using a method so audacious it would have seemed impossible if it had not actually worked. They loaded 2 locomotives with explosives and ran them together at full speed at the midpoint of the bridge. The resulting explosion brought down the entire span. When North Vietnam began rebuilding in 1957, they constructed something far stronger. The new bridge was completed in 1964. Ho Chi Minh himself attended the opening ceremony, personally inaugurating what would become the most contested piece of real estate in Southeast Asia. The structure that emerged was 540 feet long and 56 feet wide. A conventional steel through truss design, it rested on a massive central pier of reinforced concrete 16 feet in diameter, with solid concrete abutments anchored into hills on both sides of the Song Ma River. The bridge stood approximately 50 feet above the water, carrying both a railroad track down its center and cantilevered roadways on either side for trucks and foot traffic. Every bullet, every bomb, every soldier heading south to fight American forces would cross this bridge. Destroying it would sever the jugular of the North Vietnamese supply line. The man leading the first major strike was Lieutenant Colonel James Robinson Risner, an 8-victory ace from the Korean War and one of the most celebrated fighter pilots in the Air Force. Risner had shot down 8 MiGs flying his F-86 Sabre a decade earlier. In 1957, he had set a transatlantic speed record, flying from New York to Paris in 6 hours and 37 minutes. He had appeared on the cover of Time magazine. If anyone could destroy the Dragon's Jaw, it would be Robbie Risner. His strike package was massive by any standard. 46 Republic F-105 Thunder Chiefs formed the main attack force, each one capable of carrying more bomb tonnage than a World War II B-17. 21 F-100 Super Sabres flew escort. 2 RF-101 Voodoos would photograph the results. 10 KC-135 tankers kept everyone fueled. 79 aircraft in total, an armada that represented the pinnacle of American tactical air power. 16 of the Thunder Chiefs carried a pair of AGM-12 bullpup missiles each, early guided weapons that required the pilot to visually track the missile using a flare on its tail while steering it to the target with a joystick. The remaining 30 aircraft each carried 8 750-pound bombs. 3 tons of explosives per aircraft, more than the heaviest bombers had dropped on Berlin. Shortly after noon, the strike force arrived over the target. What happened next would haunt American aviation for years. The first bullpups streaked toward the bridge. Captain Bill Meyerholt watched his missile make what appeared to be a good hit. When the smoke cleared, there was no visible damage. The 250-pound warhead had simply bounced off the massive structure. Pilot after pilot released their bullpups and watched the missiles explode against steel and concrete that refused to yield. The 750-pound bombs fared no better. A strong southwest wind pushed the first wave off target. The last flight, led by Harris himself, scored direct hits on the roadway and superstructure. When the smoke finally cleared after 32 bullpups and 120 bombs had charred every inch of the bridge, the Dragon's Jaw stood defiant. Traffic was stopped for a few hours while repair crews swept debris from the roadway. By nightfall, trucks were rolling south again. The strike had cost 2 aircraft. One F-100 was shot down during flak suppression, killing Lieutenant George Smith. An RF-101 reconnaissance aircraft went down 75 miles southwest of the target. seriously injuring Captain Herschel Morgan, who became one of the first American prisoners of war. Risner's own Thunder Chief was crippled by ground fire. Despite smoke filling his cockpit, he nursed the damaged aircraft all the way to Da Nang, and the bridge had not suffered a single structural failure. The next day, April 4th, Risner led 48 Thunder Chiefs back to the bridge, this time carrying only 750-pound bombs, since the bullpups had proven worthless. Again, the aircraft scored multiple hits. Again, the bridge stood, but this time, the North Vietnamese Air Force was waiting. 8 MiG-17s from the 901st Fighter Regiment scrambled from Noi Bai Air Base. These were subsonic fighters designed in the early 1950s, armed only with 323mm cannons. On paper, they had no business challenging supersonic American jets carrying air-to-air missiles. Flight leader Tran Han spotted 4 bomb-laden F-105s starting their attack runs and dove on them from above. Major Frank Bennett never knew what hit him. Han's cannon fire sent his Thunder Chief spiraling into the Gulf of Tonkin. A second MiG-17, piloted by Lamin Huan, caught Captain J. Magnuson's aircraft with a burst that left it barely controllable. Magnuson radioed that he was heading for the Gulf, hoping to reach water before ejecting. He bailed out 20 miles offshore near the island of Han Mei. Search teams looked for 2 days but never found him. He was listed as missing in action and later declared killed. 2 American supersonic fighter bombers had been shot down by subsonic MiGs in the first significant air-to-air engagement of the Vietnam War. The F-100 Super Sabres that provided escort had engaged the MiGs with cannon fire and missiles. Captain Donald Kilgus dropped his wing tanks and turned into one of the enemy fighters just as it emerged from the haze. His 20mm cannon fire appeared to damage the aircraft, and he was later credited with a probable kill. But the MiGs had made their point. They could challenge American aircraft even with vastly inferior technology, if they chose their moment carefully. The North Vietnamese celebrated the 2-day battle as a glorious victory. They later designated April 3rd as Air Force Day. They awarded Tran Han the title of National Hero. On the 45th anniversary of the battle in 2010, Vietnam commemorated the defense of the bridge as a symbol of the Vietnamese people's will to defend their country. They claimed 47 American aircraft shot down over the 454 sorties flown in those first 2 days, a figure that American records dispute, but which illustrates how central the Dragon's Jaw became to North Vietnamese national identity. The engagement had implications far beyond the immediate tactical results. American fighter community leaders were shocked that relatively slow MiG-17s could shoot down advanced F-105 Thunder Chiefs. The lessons learned would eventually lead to the establishment of the Navy's Fighter Weapons School, known as Top Gun, and fundamental changes in how American pilots trained for air combat. The encounter restored dogfighting to air combat doctrine after years of emphasis on missile technology. The pattern was established. American planners had vastly underestimated the strength of the target and vastly overestimated the power of their weapons. Over the following months and years, the attacks continued with an almost obsessive regularity. In May 1965 alone, American aircraft dropped 128 tons of ordnance on and around the Dragon's Jaw. Between January and March 1967, no fewer than 30 airstrikes targeted the bridge. Different aircraft types were employed: A-3 Sky Warriors, A-4 Skyhawks, A-6 Intruders, F-4 Phantoms, F-8 Crusaders. Different weapons were tried. The television-guided AGM-62 Walleye allowed pilots to veer away from the target while still guiding the missile, offering some protection from ground fire. It lacked the punch to bring down the massive concrete piers. The North Vietnamese responded to each attack by expanding their defenses until the Dragon's Jaw became, in the words of historians Stephen Kuntz and Barrett Tillman, the most heavily defended target on Earth. 5 air defense regiments eventually surrounded the bridge. Each regiment typically included about 1,000 personnel operating approximately 36 medium or heavy anti-aircraft guns. When surface-to-air missile batteries were added, they brought their own additional artillery for close-in defense. The total defensive network could include 150 to 200 anti-aircraft batteries of varying calibers, capable of putting up a wall of steel through which American pilots had to fly. The SA-2 guideline surface to air missiles were particularly feared. These Soviet-designed weapons stood 35 feet tall, earning them the nickname flying telephone poles among American pilots. Their radar guidance systems could track and engage aircraft at high altitude, forcing attackers down into the dense anti-aircraft fire at lower levels. But dropping below the missile envelope meant entering the killing zone of the guns. Below 2,000 feet, small arms became the most serious threat. Between 2,000 and 20,000 feet, batteries of 30-centimeter, 57, 85 mm, and 100-millimeter guns filled the sky with explosive shells. The air defenses created a layered trap with no safe altitude. By late 1968, North Vietnam had increased the number of anti-aircraft guns from about 700 in 1965 to more than 8,000. The light anti-aircraft guns alone, weapons with calibers from 12.7mm machine guns to 57mm automatic cannons, would ultimately account for more than 77% of Air Force combat losses and 52% of Navy losses during the war. The heavy weapons got the headlines, but the smaller guns did the killing. The human cost mounted steadily. From April to September 1965, 19 more American pilots were shot down in the general vicinity of the bridge. The names would become a roll call of POW survivors and fallen heroes. Howie Rutledge, Gerald Coffey, Paul Galanti, Jeremiah Denton, Bill Schutte, and James Stockdale, who would spend 7.5 years in captivity and later become an admiral and receive the Medal of Honor for his resistance to torture. On September 16, 1965, Risner himself was shot down while hunting surface-to-air missile sites near the bridge. His F-105 took hits in the air intakes while flying at low altitude and approximately 600 miles per hour. He ejected and injured his knee during the landing, which contributed to his capture. The man on the cover of Time magazine, the Korean War ace who had been expected to destroy the Dragon's jaw on the first day, was now a prisoner. He would spend 7 years in the Hanoi Hilton, 4 of them in solitary confinement. The North Vietnamese had seen his photograph in the magazine and considered him a prize catch. Among those captured was Captain Carlisle Harris, who had scored the best hits during the first attack on April 3, 1965. His F-105 was shot down over the bridge the very next day, on his second mission there. About 20 villagers captured him as he landed. He spent 2,871 days in captivity, much of it at the Hanoi Hilton. The prison known officially as Hoa Lo had been built by the French in the 1890s when they ruled Vietnam as a colonial power. The city block-sized structure had held Vietnamese political prisoners in squalid conditions for decades before American aviators arrived. The prisoners gave different sections nicknames that captured their grim humor: Heartbreak Hotel, New Guy Village, Little Vegas, Alcatraz. The complex was so formidable that not a single American serviceman managed to escape during the entire war. The treatment violated every provision of the Geneva Convention that North Vietnam had signed. Prisoners endured solitary confinement lasting months or years. Torture sessions used ropes tied around arms and stretched until elbows touched, bending bodies into bows of agony. Sleep deprivation, starvation, beatings, and psychological abuse were routine. An estimated 95% of prisoners in the North experienced some form of torture. 113 American prisoners of war died in captivity. While there, Harris remembered a tap code his survival training instructor had mentioned during a coffee break. He perfected it and taught it to fellow prisoners. The code spread throughout the POW camps and became the primary means of communication for hundreds of American prisoners, allowing them to maintain morale, share intelligence, and organize resistance to their captors. Commander Jeremiah Denton was shot down on July 18, 1965, while leading 28 aircraft on a bombing mission near Thanh Hoa. During a televised press conference arranged by his captors in May 1966, Denton became the first American to confirm that prisoners were being tortured. He blinked the word Torture in Morse code while speaking on camera. His captors never noticed. He spent nearly 8 years in various prison camps, including stints in the Hanoi Hilton, the Zoo, Little Vegas, and Alcatraz. The frustration of military planners led to increasingly desperate measures. In May 1966, the Air Force launched Operation Carolina Moon, one of the most audacious and unusual attacks of the entire war. Engineers at the Armament Laboratory at Eglin Air Force Base in Florida had developed a massive floating bomb. Each weapon weighed approximately 4,000 pounds, was 8 feet in diameter and 3 feet tall, with half that weight consisting of high explosives, using a new energy mass focusing concept similar to a shaped charge. The plan was to drop these enormous mines from C-130 Hercules cargo aircraft into the Songma River upstream of the bridge. The mines would float down to the structure, where magnetic sensors would detect the steel trusses and detonate the charges. The Tactical Air Warfare Center had analyzed the proposal and concluded that the chances of success were small because the mines might run aground before reaching the target. Alternative proposals apparently offered even less chance of success, so Carolina Moon went forward anyway. 2 crews from the 61st Troop Carrier Squadron at Seward Air Force Base in Tennessee trained extensively at Eglin for the mission. Major Richard Reimers commanded the first aircraft. Major Thomas Case commanded the second. On the night of May 30th, 1966, Reimers took off from Da Nang at 12:25 in the morning and flew north under radio silence. The lumbering C-130 approached the Song Ma River at only 100 feet above the ground, traveling at 150 knots. Heavy but inaccurate anti-aircraft fire opened up across the river valley as the aircraft neared the drop zone. Reimers successfully released 5 of the massive floating bombs and escaped to the safety of the Gulf of Tonkin. The next morning, reconnaissance photographs showed the bridge still standing with no evidence of damage. What the Americans did not know was that 4 of the 5 mines had actually detonated under the bridge, exactly as designed. A North Vietnamese prisoner captured later confirmed this. The focused explosives that engineers believed would devastate the structure simply lacked the power to damage the massive concrete pier. A second mission was scheduled for the following night. Major Case volunteered to fly it, taking Lieutenant Rocky Edmondson from Reimers' crew because his experience might prove valuable. Case's C-130 departed Da Nang just after 1 in the morning on May 31st. F-4 Phantoms flew diversionary strikes in the area. One of the F-4 crews reported heavy anti-aircraft fire and a large ground flash approximately 2 minutes before the scheduled drop time. Case's aircraft was never heard from again. The C-130 was shot down with all 8 crew members aboard. Major Case, First Lieutenant Harold Zook, First Lieutenant Armin Shingeldecker, Captain Emmett McDonald, Lieutenant Edmondson, Staff Sergeant Bobby Alberton, Airman First Class Elroy Harworth, Airman First Class Philip Stickney. All were listed as missing in action. It was not until 1986 that the Vietnamese returned the remains of some of the crew without explanation. Others are still listed as missing. The diversionary F-4 supporting the mission was also shot down, presumably killing First Lieutenant Ned Harold and Lieutenant Colonel Dayton Ragland. Ragland had spent 2 years as a prisoner of war in Korea. He was on his 98th mission in Vietnam, nearly time to return home. The Dragon's Jaw had claimed another crew, and still the bridge stood. When President Lyndon Johnson halted bombing of North Vietnam on October 31st, 1968, hoping to influence peace negotiations, the running tally stood at 12 aircraft lost directly attacking the Dragon's Jaw. 13 airmen were dead or missing. 7 more had been captured and imprisoned. And an estimated 104 American pilots had been shot down within a 75-square-mile area around the bridge during the entire Rolling Thunder campaign. The bridge had become an obsession that consumed men and machines while producing nothing but frustration. Fighter pilots composed a cynical rewording of the folk song Red River Valley about the deadly missions to the Dragon's Jaw. Author Tom Wolfe recorded a rueful story that circulated among Navy pilots who flew against the bridge. In their telling, the Earth consisted of 2 hemispheres, spring-loaded and held together opposite the hinge by the Thanh Hoa Bridge. When the bridge was finally destroyed, the story went, the 2 hemispheres would fly apart and fling humanity into space. It was gallows humor, born of desperation. The bombing halt lasted from late 1968 until early 1972. During this period, the North Vietnamese worked constantly to restore and strengthen their infrastructure. They used the time to repair not just the bridge, but their entire transportation network. The Dragon's Jaw received 8 additional concrete piers, making it even more resistant to bomb damage. Workers strengthened the abutments and replaced damaged steel. Massive quantities of anti-aircraft weapons flowed in from the Soviet Union and China. By the time American bombers returned, the defenses were stronger than ever. The Soviet Union had replaced China as North Vietnam's primary military patron during the late 1960s, and the quality of weapons improved accordingly. New radar systems tracked incoming aircraft with greater precision. The SA-2 missile batteries received updated guidance equipment. Fire control systems coordinated the efforts of multiple batteries. The integrated air defense network that protected the Dragon's Jaw and its approaches became even more formidable than during Rolling Thunder. The Vietnamese also developed sophisticated repair capabilities. After successful strikes temporarily closed the bridge, repair crews would swarm over the structure, working through the night to restore traffic. Prefabricated sections were stockpiled nearby. Welders, engineers, and laborers formed experienced teams that could patch damage within days or even hours. Destroying the bridge for a few days accomplished nothing if supplies simply accumulated and then resumed flowing once repairs were complete. The target required permanent destruction, not temporary interdiction. What changed everything was happening not in the skies over Vietnam, but in the laboratories of Texas Instruments and the testing ranges at Eglin Air Force Base. The company had been working on a surface-to-air missile seeker when executive Glenn Peniston attempted to sell the technology to the Air Force. Colonel Joe Davis inquired whether the system could instead be adapted for ground attack to overcome the accuracy problems plaguing bombing missions in Vietnam. Davis had already witnessed tests of a new laser target designator made by Martin Marietta and had conducted experiments from the back seat of an F-4 Phantom, proving that objects could be accurately designated from a moving aircraft. The Pavway program started in 1964 on a shoestring budget. The first test weapon, using an M117 bomb as the warhead, was dropped in April 1965. The same month, Risner led the first attacks on the Dragon's Jaw. In January 1967, the Air Force authorized Project 3169 as the formal engineering program for precision-guided munitions. The contract with Texas Instruments was renewed in March, with an aggressive timeline projecting deployment to Vietnam for combat testing in just 1 year. The Guided Bomb Program Office at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base took direction of the effort in August. Flight testing began at Eglin in November. The idea was elegantly simple. A laser beam would illuminate the target. A seeker on the bomb would detect the reflected laser light and guide the weapon toward the illuminated spot. The seeker used a bang-bang control system where each control surface was either straight or fully deflected. This was inefficient aerodynamically, but reduced costs and minimized demands on the primitive onboard electronics. During testing, it took only 6 attempts to improve accuracy from 148 feet to within 10 feet of the target. This vastly exceeded design requirements. The first laser-guided bombs, known as Paveway, were ready for combat testing by May 1968. Without proper targeting pods, the weapon systems officer in the back seat of the F-4 Phantom used a handheld airborne laser designator to keep the laser on target. Half of the weapons still hit their targets, despite the difficulties inherent in this method. Circular error probability in combat was as little as 8 feet. By comparison, unguided bombs had a built-in error of approximately 20 inches of dispersion for every 1,000 feet of fall. The difference was revolutionary. An Air Force study found that laser-guided bombs were 100 to 200 times more effective than conventional bombs against very hard targets, and 20 to 40 times more effective against soft and area targets. The cost per target destroyed dropped dramatically despite the additional expense of the guidance systems. Fewer weapons meant fewer sorties, which meant fewer aircraft losses and fewer pilots killed or captured. The technology continued improving during the bombing halt. The handheld Zot box gave way to the AN AVQ-10 Pave Knife Pod, a gimbal-mounted laser designator that could swivel to keep the beam on target, even as the aircraft maneuvered. This eliminated the dangerous requirement to fly a continuous pylon turn around the target. By 1972, the weapons were ready for the most important test of all. On March 30th, 1972, 30,000 North Vietnamese troops supported by tanks and artillery rolled across the demilitarized zone in what became known as the Easter Offensive. Nearly all American ground forces had been withdrawn under President Nixon's Vietnamization policy. The invasion caught the Army of the Republic of Vietnam and their American advisors completely unprepared. Nixon responded with Operation Linebacker, the first continuous bombing campaign against North Vietnam since Rolling Thunder ended in 1968. American air power surged back into the theater. B-52 strategic bombers struck targets throughout the North. Fighter bombers attacked bridges, rail yards, and supply depots. On May 8th, Navy aircraft mined the approaches to Haiphong Harbor, and that evening, Nixon addressed the nation to announce the new offensive. The objectives were clear: isolate North Vietnam from its sources of supply by destroying railroad bridges and rolling stock, target primary storage areas and marshalling yards, eliminate or damage the air defense system. With 85% of North Vietnamese imports arriving by sea, now blocked by mines, cutting the land routes from China became critical. The new campaign had advantages that Rolling Thunder never possessed. The restrictions that had protected targets near Hanoi and Haiphong were lifted. And American forces had accumulated years of experience with the enemy's defenses. Electronic countermeasures had improved dramatically, and the precision-guided munitions that had been tested during the bombing halt were ready for combat. On May 10th, the first day of Linebacker, 16 F-4 Phantoms of the 8th Tactical Fighter Wing attacked the Paul Doomer Bridge, a mile-long structure spanning the Red River between Hanoi and Haiphong. This bridge had also resisted years of conventional bombing. The Phantoms carried 2,000-pound electro-optically guided bombs. The next day, 4 more Phantoms returned with pave-knife laser designator pods and laser-guided bombs. Captain Thomas Messett led the small strike force. The defenders did not believe 4 aircraft could be the main attack and held their fire too long. All 8 bombs scored direct hits, dropping the entire span on the Hanoi side into the river. The Paul Doomer Bridge, which had seemed as invulnerable as the Dragon's Jaw, fell in a single mission. And the Dragon's Jaw was once again at the top of the target list. On April 27, 1972, 12 F-4 Phantoms of the 8th Tactical Fighter Wing based at Ubon Royal Thai Air Force Base attacked the Thanh Hoa Bridge. 8 of the aircraft carried paveway laser-guided bombs. Heavy cloud cover prevented the use of laser illuminators on that mission, forcing the strike force to employ television-guided bombs instead. They damaged the highway sections, but failed to bring down any spans. The weather improved by May 13th. 14 Phantoms headed for the Dragon's Jaw, carrying 9 3,000-pound laser-guided bombs, 15 2,000-pound laser-guided bombs, and 48 conventional 500-pound bombs, because there were not enough precision weapons to arm every aircraft. The 8th Tactical Fighter Wing, known as the Wolf Pack, had been fighting over Vietnam since December 1965. They had accumulated more experience with laser-guided weapons than any other unit in the theater. Their F-4D Phantoms had been the first in Southeast Asia to receive the new aircraft variant, giving the wing the distinction of leading the precision bombing effort. The pave-knife targeting pods that made laser guidance possible were in critically short supply. Only 12 had been built for the testing program. When preparations for Linebacker began, 3 pods stayed stateside to continue development. 3 went to the Navy for use on specially wired A-6 intruders. 6 went to the 8th Tactical Fighter Wing at Ubon for use on their F-4D Phantoms. 2 of those precious pods were lost over North Vietnam during Linebacker. The remaining 4 became some of the most valuable pieces of equipment in the entire war. The strike force flew through an intense barrage of anti-aircraft fire. The air defenses that had accumulated over 7 years threw everything they had at the incoming aircraft. SAMs rose from their launchers. Anti-aircraft guns filled the sky with tracers and exploding shells. But the Phantoms did not have to fly the low-level runs that conventional bombing required. They could release their weapons from higher altitude and let the seekers guide them to the target. One by one, the laser-guided bombs fell toward the illuminated aiming points on the bridge. When the dust cleared, the western span of the Dragon's Jaw had fallen into the Songma River. After 7 years, 871 sorties, 11 lost aircraft, and an immeasurable cost in lives and suffering, the bridge that had seemed invincible was finally broken. The destruction was not complete. Navy and Air Force aircraft continued, attacking throughout the summer and fall of 1972. The 8th Tactical Fighter Wing had only 6 pave-knife pods, and these precious pieces of equipment were reserved for the most critical targets. General John Vught, commander of the 7th Air Force, reportedly told his pilots they had better not come back without those pods. On October 6, 1972, 4 A-7 Corsair attack aircraft from VA-82 aboard USS America delivered the final blow. The squadron had deployed in June for what would become a 10-month combat cruise. They flew the A-7C version of the Corsair, having reverted from the A-7E due to unexpected problems with the TF-41 engines. Lieutenant Commander Leighton Smith, who would later rise to the rank of 4-star admiral, led the mission with his wingman Lieutenant Junior Grade Marvin Baldwin. Each carried 2 Walleye 2 guided bombs, the upgraded version with a 1,900-pound warhead and 35-mile standoff range that allowed them to launch from outside the lethal envelope of anti-aircraft fire. The Walleye 2, nicknamed Fat Albert by pilots, was a different weapon from the earlier version that had proven inadequate against the bridge. Its hefty warhead could finally match the massive concrete and steel construction. The 2 other A-7s in the flight carried conventional Mk-84 2,000-pound bombs. The combined attack struck the center piling on the bridge's west side and broke the span in half. After this final strike, the Thanh Hoa Bridge was considered permanently destroyed and removed from the target list. The USS America and her flight crews received a meritorious unit commendation for their roles in the operation. VA-82 would go on to receive many of the Navy's most prestigious awards, including the Wade McCluskey Award as Most Outstanding Attack Squadron. Author Walter Boyne wrote about the final strike. At long last, after 7 years, 871 sorties, tremendous expenditure in lives, 11 lost aircraft, and a bewildering array of expended munitions, the Dragon's Jaw was finally broken. The statistics tell part of the story. During Operation Linebacker, the Air Force destroyed more than 100 bridges in the first 3 months using precision-guided munitions. The Paul Doomer Bridge near Hanoi, a mile-long structure that had also resisted years of conventional bombing, fell to laser-guided bombs in May 1972. Smart weapons accounted for about 10% of attack sorties against enemy tanks, but destroyed 22% of the tanks hit. But numbers cannot capture what the fall of the Dragon's Jaw truly meant. For 7 years, this single bridge had symbolized the limits of American technological superiority. The most powerful air force in history, equipped with supersonic jets and guided missiles, could not destroy a structure that Viet Minh guerrillas had demolished with 2 locomotives and some explosives. The bridge stood as proof that industrial might and sophisticated weapons were not enough to win a war against a determined enemy. The psychological impact on both sides was immense. North Vietnamese morale had been sustained by the invincibility of the Dragon's Jaw. Every failed American attack reinforced the narrative that their enemy could be resisted. When the bridge finally fell, it fell not to overwhelming force, but to a new technology that made precision possible. The laser-guided bomb changed the equation fundamentally. For American pilots, the destruction of the Dragon's Jaw proved that their sacrifices had not been in vain. The men who had died and the men who had spent years in prison camps had forced the development of weapons that would protect future aviators. The circular error probability of early smart bombs was measured in single digits of feet. Compare this to the 420-foot average miss distance during World War II and the continuing inaccuracy that plagued conventional bombing in Vietnam. The lessons learned over the Dragon's Jaw shaped modern air warfare. Smart weapons reduced the number of aircraft required for a mission, which reduced exposure to enemy defenses. Precision allowed strikes near civilian areas without the collateral damage that conventional bombing made inevitable. The cost per target destroyed dropped, while effectiveness increased by orders of magnitude. In the 1991 Gulf War, precision-guided munitions represented 8% of weapons dropped, but achieved many of the most spectacular results. Laser-guided bombs struck targets with average accuracy of 10 feet. Lantern targeting pods allowed fighters to use infrared sensors for night delivery of precision weapons. The technology that proved itself over the Song Ma River in 1972 had matured into systems that could put a bomb through a specific window of a specific building. The stealth aircraft, developed after Vietnam, including the F-117 Nighthawk, were designed specifically to deliver precision weapons. The GBU-27 that destroyed hardened bunkers in Iraq was a direct descendant of the Pavway bombs that broke the Dragon's Jaw. The cost advantage was staggering. During Vietnam, it might take hundreds of conventional bombs to destroy a single bridge, with each sortie risking an aircraft and crew. With precision weapons, a single bomb could accomplish what entire strike packages had failed to do. The expense of the guidance systems was dwarfed by the savings in aircraft, fuel, ordnance, and most importantly, human lives. The bridge itself was rebuilt after the war ended. The North Vietnamese restored it in 1973, and it remains in use today, primarily carrying rail traffic. A newer, larger highway bridge was built downstream. The old Dragon's Jaw still stands, a reminder of the years when it seemed nothing could bring it down. The men who survived the Thanh Hoa campaign carried the experience for the rest of their lives. Robinson Risner, the Korean War ace who led the first attack and spent 7 years as a prisoner, retired as a brigadier general. He told his story in a memoir titled The Passing of the Night and became an advocate for veterans and prisoners of war. He died in 2013 and is buried at Arlington National Cemetery. James Stockdale, who was shot down in September 1965 and organized resistance among the prisoners, received the Medal of Honor for his actions in captivity. He retired as a vice admiral, became president of the Naval War College, and ran for vice president on Ross Perot's independent ticket in 1992. His wife Sybil helped lead the effort to publicize the treatment of POWs and bring them home. Carlisle Harris, who taught the tap code that allowed prisoners to communicate through prison walls, retired as a colonel. The code he spread became a lifeline for hundreds of American captives. It used a 5x5 grid with the letters of the alphabet, minus the letter K, which was replaced by C. The first set of taps indicated the row, the second the column. Prisoners became so proficient they could carry on entire conversations through concrete walls. When prisoners returned from torture sessions, the first thing they heard was tapping on the walls, 3 letters that meant everything. GBU. God bless you. When someone new arrived, experienced prisoners would tap out the rules of resistance. When someone broke under torture, they would tap encouragement. The code bound them together in a community that their captors could not completely isolate. Commander Everett Alvarez, the first American aviator shot down over North Vietnam in August 1964, spent nearly 9 years in captivity. He later wrote that the prisoners were lucky to have Risner and Stockdale. With Stockdale, we had wisdom, he said. With Risner, we had spirituality. Both men provided examples of resistance that sustained prisoners through years of solitary confinement, torture, and deprivation. Jeremiah Denton, who blinked the word torture in Morse code during a propaganda interview, served as a United States Senator from Alabama after his release. He wrote his own memoir, When Hell Was in Session, describing his nearly 8 years in captivity. The crews of Operation Carolina Moon have no such stories. Major Thomas Case and the 7 men aboard his C-130 remain among the missing of the Vietnam War. The floating bombs they delivered proved that no amount of creativity could overcome the fundamental problem. Until weapons could be precisely aimed at specific points on a structure, the Dragon's jaw would continue to stand. The final tally speaks to the cost of imprecision. Over the course of Rolling Thunder and Linebacker, the Thanh Hoa Bridge absorbed 871 combat sorties. Hundreds of bombs and missiles struck or exploded near the structure. 11 aircraft were lost, directly attacking the bridge, but an estimated 104 pilots were shot down within the heavily defended area around it. The 5 air defense regiments that protected the Dragon's jaw also engaged aircraft passing through on other missions, multiplying the casualties. When laser-guided bombs finally brought the bridge down, they achieved in a handful of missions what 7 years of conventional attacks could not. The difference was not more bombs or bigger explosions. It was the ability to put those explosions precisely where they needed to be. Technology had solved a problem that brute force could not. The Dragon's Jaw story contains a warning as well as a triumph. For 7 years, American military planners continued attacking the same target with methods that had already proven inadequate. The escalation was quantitative rather than qualitative. More bombs, more sorties, more elaborate schemes like floating mines down a river. Only when a fundamentally different approach emerged, one that addressed the actual problem of accuracy rather than the assumed problem of firepower, did success become possible. The North Vietnamese rebuilt the bridge within a year of its destruction, but they could not rebuild the illusion of invincibility. The Dragon's Jaw that rose from the Song Ma after 1973 was just a bridge, no longer a symbol of resistance to American power. Laser-guided weapons had changed the calculus of air warfare permanently. For the families of the men lost over the Thanh Hoa Bridge, there is no technological triumph that compensates for their sacrifice. The bridge claimed some of the finest pilots in American military aviation. It sent others to years of torture and deprivation in the Hanoi Hilton. It became a graveyard for aircraft that represented the cutting edge of aerospace technology. What remained after the smoke cleared and the bombs stopped falling was a lesson written in blood. Sometimes the most powerful weapons are not the largest or the most destructive. Sometimes victory comes from precision rather than force, from putting exactly the right weapon in exactly the right place at exactly the right time. The pilots who flew against the Dragon's Jaw did not fail because they lacked courage or skill. They failed because they were sent to do an impossible job with inadequate tools. When the tools finally matched the task, 14 aircraft accomplished what 871 sorties could not. The laser-guided bombs that fell on the Thanh Hoa Bridge in May and October of 1972 did more than destroy a span of steel and concrete. They announced the arrival of a new era in warfare, one in which precision would matter more than volume and accuracy would trump explosive power. Every smart bomb and guided missile that has followed traces its lineage to those weapons that finally broke the Dragon's Jaw. The bridge that Ho Chi Minh inaugurated in 1964, that the North Vietnamese defended with more anti-aircraft weapons than any target in history, that consumed 11 American aircraft and broke the bodies and spirits of dozens of captured pilots, that inspired gallows humor about the Earth splitting apart when it finally fell, proved vulnerable to a technology that cost a fraction of the ordnance expended against it. In the end, the Dragon's Jaw was not slain by brute force or massive firepower. It was defeated by human ingenuity applied to a specific problem. The same ingenuity that allowed Viet Minh guerrillas to destroy the original bridge with 2 locomotives in 1945 eventually produced weapons that could put a bomb within feet of its intended target from thousands of feet above. The 7-year battle for the Thanh Hoa Bridge transformed air warfare and the men who waged it. Those who survived carried scars, physical and psychological, for the rest of their lives. Those who did not survive left families who still wonder what might have been. And the lessons learned over that river in North Vietnam continue to shape how nations wage war from the sky. The Dragon's jaw finally broke on October 6, 1972. But the story of how it broke and why it took so long remains one of the most significant chapters in the history of military aviation. From frustration came innovation. From failure came transformation. From the most heavily defended target on Earth came weapons that would make future targets indefensible. That is the legacy of the 871 sorties that failed and the handful that finally succeeded. That is what the pilots who died and the prisoners who endured purchased with their suffering. And that is why the name Dragon's Jaw still resonates with anyone who studies the evolution of air power. The bridge still stands today, rebuilt and functional, carrying trains across the Song Ma River as it did before the war. Tourists occasionally visit the site where so much blood was spilled. The Vietnamese erected monuments celebrating their defense of the bridge as a symbol of national resistance. For Americans, the legacy is different. The Thanh Hoa Bridge represents both a cautionary tale about the limits of conventional thinking and a testament to the power of innovation under pressure. The technology that emerged from those failures protects pilots and saves lives to this day. Every precision strike that avoids civilian casualties, every mission that destroys a target without losing an aircraft, carries forward what was learned over the Dragon's Jaw. The men who flew those missions would probably say, that is enough. They did their duty in the skies over North Vietnam, facing the most lethal air defenses in the world to attack a target that refused to fall. When they finally got the right tools for the job, they finished it. And in doing so, they changed warfare forever.